Thank you all so much for coming today. A special thank you to the panel, to Professor Lata, to Professor Jaime, Professor Carlos, and especially a special thank you to Professor Apolinar, who is also my director of this project. Today, I'll be sharing with you my research proposal, which is titled The Development of a Conceptual Model of Agroecosystems Management that Strengthens Biocultural Processes and Contributes to Food Sovereignty in Indigenous Reservations of SILVIA, Cauca. This is part of the Environmental Science Doctorate program at the University of Cauca and is supported by two research projects, the Water Security and Sustainability Hub and SHARE, which is with Regalias in Colombia. As the professor mentioned, I'll be doing the presentation in English and then the questions portion in Spanish and in English to accommodate all languages. This is our agenda for today. And before we begin, I'd like to start with a bit of personal context. For me, food systems has always been a fascinating and interesting point of connection around the world. And since I arrived in Cauca in 2018, food has been a connector for me for the entire region of Cauca. Over almuerzos of sancocho, over cups of locally grown coffee, I've really learned so much about the history, the political dynamics, and most of all, the culture of this really rich, diverse area. So throughout the presentation, I'll be using the term food systems, which refers to the production, the processing, the transportation, the commercialization, as well as the consumption of food. It goes across multiple scales, and the scale that I'll be focusing on is the most localized scale of food systems, the agroecosystem within territories. However, it's important to consider different levels of regional, national, and international food systems, as it is a globalized world and the connections do cross all these different boundaries. To analyze food systems, I've chosen to use the food regime framework, which has been developed by Harriet Friedman and Philip McMichael. And how they define a food regime is a hegemonic power during times of so-called stability that heavily influences world food system dynamics. So it's really a systems approach to studying food systems. Food systems is not an isolated system that can just be seen through a biological or a chemistry lens, but it is intertwined with economic and political systems as well. And according to these authors, there have been three distinct food regimes in modern times. And what we're in right now, there's a bit of debate if it's the hegemonic power of corporations, if it's more neoliberal governments that are dictating activities in the food system, or there's arguments that we're moving away from a food regime and power is becoming more decentralized. So within these food regimes, there have been prominent events that have dictated the certain dynamics and where we find ourselves today in the food system. I'd like to highlight a few specific ones. First is the introduction of agrochemicals. And so before World War II, all of farming was organic. But during World War II, when they discovered that warfare chemicals such as Agent Orange is effective in reducing plagues and different types of disease in agriculture, it became widespread used. That then led into technological advances, which birthed into the Green Revolution. And this is really the point in time where what's called the Global North, although we have a lot of difficulties with this term, I'll be using them throughout the presentation just because it's consistent in the literature. So the Green Revolution is really when the Global North became present in food systems in the Global South and really industrialized food systems, homogenizing practices and bringing in ways of knowing and ways of cultivating that were not endogenous to these places. Then moved on into the 80s and 90s with neoliberal policies, and that further exacerbated inequalities between the Global North and the Global South. And today, with the presence of corporate power and the concentration of power among the food system, these inequalities have exacerbated. So the study area that I'm focusing on is the municipality of SILVIA, which is located in the northwestern part of the Department of Cauca in southwestern Colombia. It sits in the central range of the Colombian Andes Mountains and is also located in the Colombian Massif. So this is a very important area for hydrologically for the country. Some of the most important rivers begin in the Colombian Massif and is responsible for 70% of the country's fresh water. Specifically in SILVIA, it's found the tributaries of the Cauca River, and it's located in the upper Cauca River Basin. The main ecosystems in SILVIA are agroecosystems, Andean humid forests, wetlands, and páramos. Paramos is also a very important ecosystem for water regulation, water storage, and distribution, and they're also endemic to Andean ecosystems. The main activity for economic sustainability in Silvia is agricultural production, and a lot of the land use is dedicated to such. And a very unique aspect of Silvia is that 86% of the population is indigenous. And within the municipality of Silvia, there are 6 indigenous reservations, which are called resguardos, which is a Spanish-created idea as well as name. I'm going to be focused on working with 2 main communities, the Misak peoples of the Guambilla Reservation and the Kishu peoples of the Quisgo Reservation. And while they are living in the same area, there are distinct differences. In Guambilla, it's the largest population within Silvia, and the Misak people have been long recognized and seen externally as a strong indigenous community. They've been at the face of indigenous movements in Cauca and also at the national level. And meanwhile, in Quisgo, they have been fighting for recognition. So only in 2017 have they been recognized as an indigenous community by the state, and they have a bit more diversity. So while there are Kishu peoples, they have other folks from different ethnic groups that have been displaced from their own territories. However, both of these communities also have really important similarities. Their cosmovision or their worldview, how they see the world, there are some similar points that is going to be consistent throughout this research. First is that they both consider themselves children or descendants of water. Both of their origin stories are from sacred lakes within their territories. They both rely on agricultural production, but rooted in their worldview of how they carry out this production, from subsistence farming until community farming into commercialized farming. And then also perhaps the most important for this research is that they consider the term territory to be much more than a spatial representation, but it's really the basis of all life. So I want to focus a little bit on this idea of territory, which from our perspective, or perhaps more of a Western lens, is defined by borders. It's more of communicated in area. It's more of a spatial representation. But territory for communities is more of a process representation. And this is where all other activities stem from. So territory not only represents where they live, but it represents biocultural processes and history. It represents their ancestors. It represents the struggles and all that they have been able to accomplish. And so I want to focus a little bit about the political structure of these indigenous territories, as it is unique to different structures within the country as well as internationally. In the 1991 reconstructed Colombian Constitution, indigenous territories or reservations were given political autonomy within their reservation to carry out governance practices. However, this is still contingent on the hierarchical structure of the country. So while there is political autonomy within the reservation, they still have to cohere to departmental, to regional, and to federal laws and politics, as well as regulations. But I'd like to speak a little bit about how it functions within the territory. So we might see it as perhaps a hierarchical structure. There is an assembly that is the collective authority, and that is when the entire community meets together and votes on certain issues. There is the cabildo, which is the council, which is elected representatives. And it changes every year, these elected representatives, because they try to have equal distribution and more equitable power available. There's roles of traditional medics. And while they do address health issues in people, really more of the role for traditional medics is to maintain harmony and balance between the territory itself, the living and the non-living, and society. So it's really expanding more beyond what territory is, what we can see, and more historically what it represents. And then at the center of it all is the family. The family is the fundamental center of the territory, and more so the kitchen within the home, and where the family educates, teaches values and beliefs. All of it first begins in the territory. And while I'm explaining it in a hierarchical structure, these two communities do not see it in a hierarchical structure, nor do they see time in linear. And so that's why I've included the Quisgo representation of political structure. They see it in a spiral sense. So it's all interconnected. and it's all moving outwards, and it starts within the center and is reiterated elsewhere. However, these communities have faced difficulties, loss of territory, and weakened autonomy really since the Spanish arrived in the 16th century. The creation of these reservations displaced many people from their lands and pushed them up into higher elevations with less fertile soil and more difficult weather. Agrarian reform connected with Green Revolution began a period of development and land grabbing. And then also in more recent times, there's been much multinational presence in territories with natural resource extraction with permission from the federal government in that power structure. And then there's hidden actors as well that cause these issues in terms of armed conflict and armed groups and illicit crop cultivation. And this is connected to the problem that I'm going to be directly addressing in my thesis, which is the difficulties that they're facing with agroecosystems within the Quisco and Guambia territories. So when we think of agroecosystems, there are three subsystems: the agricultural, the ecological, and the cultural subsystems. And the management styles are typically one of two different management styles: conventional agriculture, which we can define as a continuous movement of the Green Revolution. Conventional agriculture homogenizes growing practices. It takes growing styles and information from the global north. It uses hybridized seeds and transgenic seeds. It focuses on commercial production in terms of monocultures, and it uses extensively agrochemicals. And then the other management style is a traditional management style here in these communities and in Cauca as well. The traditional food system and traditional production has never disappeared. It's always maintained. But we've seen that there is more conventional agriculture apparent in these territories, and it's created negative impacts on these three subsystems. Also, there's external influences threatening agroecosystems within these territories, such as climate variability. Right now, we're in a 2-year period of La Niña here in Cauca, with torrential rains continuously without maximum of 3 days of sun. And so what that's caused is damage to crops. It's causing landslides, flooding, a lot of pressure in terms of crop production. Also, land grabbing continues, and the free trade agreement, specifically between the US and Colombia, has been undermining the production and commercialization of many products. So to sum it up, the problem that I'll be addressing in my research is that the dynamics of conventional agriculture and continued loss of territory that occur in indigenous reservations of the municipality of SILVIA limits the possibilities of autonomy and food sovereignty. And the research question I propose is, how could a conceptual model of agroecosystems management be developed to strengthen existing biocultural processes and contribute to food sovereignty in the indigenous reservations of Quisco and Guambia? And as such, the general objective is then to develop a conceptual model of agroecosystems management that strengthens existing biocultural processes and contributes to food sovereignty in the indigenous reservations, specifically of Quisco and Guambia. And to do this, I'll carry out 3 specific objectives. First, characterize the socio-ecological processes that indigenous communities carry out within their territories for agroecosystems management. Second, identify the indigenous and local knowledge regarding biocultural processes of agroecosystems management. And third, co-construct a conceptual model of agroecosystems management for these specific territories. And here's a visual conceptualization of how I'll carry out. The first and second objective will be carried out simultaneously. And the first objective is really, how do I see and understand agroecosystems from a Western scientific lens, doing a biophysical characterization, sociocultural characterization, and producing a diagnostic at the end of the process. Meanwhile, I also want to intend to understand agroecosystems through the eyes and through the perceptions of the communities themselves. And so really trying to understand what biocultural processes either have existed or currently exist in regards to agroecosystems management. And these 2 objectives will be in constant dialogue and communication with each other, and together will help me co-produce the conceptual model of agroecosystems management. Now I'd like to move on to the state of the art. I carried out a literature review, and the first part that I wanted to do, especially because I am a foreigner coming into this area, is understand as much as possible from existing documents regarding the area. So I looked for documents with focused on Silvia, Quisco, and Guambia. And I reviewed theses, research articles, reports, and books. I then did a Scopus search for food sovereignty. And from the 1,400 documents that appeared, I chose 71 that were most appropriate for the context of my thesis. And we can see in this graph that there is a lack of representation of Colombia on a global scale for food sovereignty papers. Similarly with agroecology, I chose 40 papers that were focused in Latin America and focused on applications. And we can also see that there is almost 10% of representation compared to the US of agroecological applications. La letra cambió. So I'd like to talk a bit about food sovereignty, since this is one of the main concepts in the presentation, in the research. So the concept of food sovereignty was popularized by La Via Campesina in the 1996 World Food Summit as a response to what they considered was inadequate, the definition of food security. And so the definition of food sovereignty is not set. There is no one definition that is used over and over. Instead, it has been adapted and applied in many different areas since the 90s in many different communities. And so what I wanted to do to help conceptualize food sovereignty without offering a reductionist definition was I looked through the main authors of this concept and pulled out 6 distinct dimensions. So there is an autonomous dimension to food sovereignty that a self-defined community can determine the conditions of their own food system. There is a political dimension where there is support from multi-levels of governance that allow fluidity and allow execution of food sovereignty. There's a theme of localization where their focus returns from globalization of food systems more to local and regional scales. There's also a sociocultural dimension that highlights the role of women within food systems, as well as labor rights and equity. And then also the nutritional aspect, which is of course to eliminate hunger and malnutrition and have healthy food for all. And then the environmental aspect, which emphasizes that agricultural production should have benevolent effects on the environment. And as we're talking about the differences, I would like to highlight that food security and food sovereignty are distinct. Sometimes I do get misconstrued or used differently, but really food security speaks of a quantity, quality, and access. These points are very important. It's not to say that they shouldn't be considered, but since the 70s, when food security was really popularized and started being used in institutional plans and governments, it has been a top-down approach. And so the definition has been defined and then trickled down. It's also considered more of a commercial product food. There is a lack of cultural aspects in the definition, and there's also no mention of how it should be produced in terms of being ecologically sustainable. And then on the flip side, food sovereignty has been a complete bottom-up conceptualization, and it really does mean something different depending on which community it's referred to. But there are some consistent aspects to it, and that food is considered something political, cultural, and socially important, and that it really does it challenges the current food regime. So in Colombia, food security has also been prevalent since the 70s. When food aid was expanded after World War II, Colombia was a receiver of food aid from the US and other countries in the global north. And then when the world food crisis hit in 72 and 73, there was a food crisis in Colombia for the lack of food aid. And so what was encouraged by international organizations such as the World Bank is that each nation itself should implement food security plans under this new development narrative and development context. So Colombia was actually the first country to implement a food and nutrition plan during this time in Latin America. And this part is pulled directly from the plan, in that the first element of the food and nutrition plan consists in a rural development strategy, pointing at a higher productivity of the big mass of farmers with little land. And so this launched a period of aggressive development of the rural countryside in Colombia. However, like I mentioned, traditional agriculture and traditional production never disappeared. And communities really were able to, and communities were able to maintain their traditional practices. And so food sovereignty emerged again, from these grassroots organizations of indigenous, of campesino, of Afro-descendant communities within Colombia to maintain traditional practices. And we still see today that there are many existing processes and hopes of expanding food sovereignty, especially in Guambia and Quisco. So these points are taken from documents that they themselves from the community have developed, and common themes of being able to recover and practice biocultural memory and processes within agriculture arises, as well as developing policies and having support from external entities for food sovereignty. And then there's also a hope to bridge the scientific knowledge from academia as well as the traditional knowledge in order to expand these processes. Here's just a few points that are taken from the territorial management plans of SILVIA, as well as in Guambia and Quisco, that emphasizes the importance of what are some of the programs they have planned that are in support of the research that I'm doing. So there is a lot of incentive for ecological production so that there's food production without much ecological damage. And then also in terms of conservation of seeds, as well as implementing types of routes that allow for self-sustainability and economic security. So next I want to talk a bit about the term agroecology, which is another focus of the research. And agroecology can be understood through three different aspects. It's considered an interdisciplinary science that combines agronomy sciences and ecological science. It can be understood as a set of practices and principles. Typically, this is associated directly with the food sovereignty movement. So when we speak of food sovereignty, agroecology is considered the technical aspect and how it is carried out in terms of production. And then agroecology is also considered a social movement that happens on parallel to food sovereignty. And in the social movement, there's advocates for rights of laborers, for rights of access, as well as gender representation. And since the 80s, there has been a lot of implementations and applications of agroecology in Latin America. And after reviewing various studies, I pulled out three main themes that when comparing agroecological production to conventional agriculture production, it was found that these farms of agroecology were more resilient to extreme weather events. They were more fertile in terms of soil quality and microorganism activity. And it was more built into connections of community. So it was able to self-organize and include the autonomy for each of these intercultural and exchanging communities. Now moving on to the theoretical framework. So there's 6 aspects of the theoretical framework that I'm going to be using that are going to help in the construction of my conceptual model. First, this research is approached from the interdisciplinary field of environmental sciences, and the research thus should be approached as an interdisciplinary or, if possible, transdisciplinary manner. And also, agroecosystems are by nature complex and will be approached using socioecological systems framework. And so how that is conceptualized is that in the center is the agricultural and livestock production system, but it sits within other systems that are in constant interaction. So while we'll be focusing one part on the exact agricultural production, it's important to know as well how that interacts with the ecological systems, and then further in the territory of the sociocultural ecosystem, and then also the ontologies and epistemologies that is transversal through all of them. So these are not approached as closed systems. There's influences such as climate, economic, and government factors, and they're also not in a complete auto-sufficient system where all that they produce stays within the territory. They're active in markets. They're going to Cali, they're coming to Popayán, to Piendamot for selling and commercializing. Next, the conceptual model will be developed using agroecological management strategies, as well as aim to strengthen the adaptability and resiliency of agroecosystems facing climate variability. So as I had mentioned, agroecology can be understood as a set of principles and practices, and these are going to be guides as we develop, together with biocultural processes that already exist, the details for the conceptual model. Agroecology is a way of organic production that tries to mimic natural systems with beneficial impacts for humans and for the environment. There's also a large social dimension to it. So unlike other frameworks for organic agriculture, agroecology has equal value to various knowledge systems, such as indigenous and local knowledges, as it does to scientific knowledges. So that's why I believe it's appropriate to work with in these indigenous communities. And the last points that will be considered is that multiple knowledge systems will be considered to understand the dynamics of these agroecosystems along with their values, beliefs, and worldviews. So really focusing on the epistemological and ontological nature for this model. And when I say knowledge systems, typically in the literature, it's divided into an indigenous and or local knowledge system versus a Western scientific knowledge system. And indigenous and local knowledge is usually referred to as experiential or tacit knowledge, something that lives isolated within a certain area. And Western scientific knowledge is usually connected to the reductionist approach to search for universal truths, very divided by disciplines. But in reality, I believe that there's fluidity between the two and that both of them exist in these points. So throughout the building of the model and throughout the research, I really try to create a knowledge ecosystem, not where we're integrating knowledges, but rather we're making relations between the two. And this idea is directly related to the noosphere, the thinking layer of the earth that connects human and non-human ways of thinking. And this is relevant in indigenous communities because there is a lot of wisdom within nature itself, especially from their perspective that I want to consider. I'd like to share a few points I believe that my research will contribute. First, this research will contribute to climate resiliency and adaptation, specifically with the form of agroecology and applications of indigenous and local knowledge as experts in their areas. Also, this will help for ongoing processes of autonomy and re-territorialization. So here in Cauca, this idea of reclaiming territory is one of the main drivers of indigenous movements. And typically in literature, an associated term of decolonization is used, but here locally, re-territorialization, because of the importance of the concept of territory, is more common. Also, I believe this thesis will contribute to the preparedness of a community when there are disruptions to the supply chain. Every so often, there's socio-political unrest, and roads are blocked in and out of Popayán, which makes it difficult for things in the supply chain to arrive. Also, we felt this extremely severe during the quarantine of the COVID-19 pandemic during 2020 and 2021, when communities realized that they were getting a lot of their supply, as well as Popayán here in the urban part, getting our supply from outside areas. And so there was a lack of basic needs. And then also in Cauca, there's still high rates of food insecurity. In 2018, the number was 64%. It's estimated to have increased since the COVID-19 has hit. And this is something that needs to be addressed in terms of nutrition and well-being. And then also perhaps the broadest and the more implicit contribution throughout this research is being able to bridge different knowledge systems together to come into this ecosystem of knowledges and be able to address these complex socio-ecological problems. So now moving to the methodological approach. As I'm leaning in towards transdisciplinarity, I really want to use participatory action research, and that is to treat and value the folks that I work with in these communities as experts and as knowledge keepers of these terms. This is going to be done through a practice of diálogo de saberes, or a dialogue of knowledge systems, which we can see here in the graphic. Here's a representation of very different forms of knowledge. And where I want to carry out the research is looking at how they all relate together and how they can complement one another to build the ecosystem of knowledge and the co-production of a conceptual model. And for the conceptual model, I'll be using Checklin soft system methodology. Now, presenting my work plan, I'd like to share a bit more detail on some of the activities, the methods, and expected results that I hope to carry out. So in the first objective, which I'll remind you is to characterize socio-ecological processes carried out by indigenous communities and their territories for agroecosystems management, is to first create the diagnostic of biophysical and sociocultural aspects, and then together with the community in participatory workshops, determine what are the priorities and which components that they are most interested in to build this conceptual model. In the second specific objective, which is to identify the indigenous and local knowledge regarding biocultural processes of agroecosystem management, I'm really using more ethnographic approach and methodologies. And so my interest is to identify, how do these folks in the community understand and define food sovereignty? Is this a term that they even use? Is there something else, how they describe what I'm trying to relay? And then also attached to that, what are their perceptions of climate, of water, of food production, and how it's changed over time? And the analysis for this will be done qualitatively in Atlas TI, as well as to create a documentary video to share externally with subtitles as well. The third objective, which is to co-construct a conceptual model of agroecosystems management within indigenous territories of Quislo and Guambia, will be the point where we're actually producing the model. So this will be done through a series of also participatory workshops and more quantitative methodologies. We'll be composing and creating seasonal agricultural calendars, introducing cartography tools and workshops so that we can create georeference maps of the agroecosystems, and also so that information will stay within the territory. And then analyze the relationships between the variables that were prioritized and identified in the first objective to build the conceptual model. And I'll be doing that through fuzzy logic cognitive mapping, which will produce a cognitive map that represents relationships and the degree of influence between variables. And once we have the model developed, we'll be able to apply different types of future scenarios that we can then see how it works within. And then finally, for my timeline, here I have a timeline divided by each objective. In the first phase and the second phase, which is the year of 2022, I plan to continue with field work, as well as do some of the more ethnographical field work, like interviews and surveys and focus groups, and also carry out with the support of the two projects of the thesis, agroecological workshops that are in the co-construction and capacitation category. And then at the beginning of next year, I plan to do my stay at Newcastle University. And there I plan to analyze them and finalize the model. Throughout this time, I'll be producing articles. And then at the end of 2023 is when I plan to do my thesis defense. So in the University of Cauca, they offer an option of publishing 3 articles in Q1 journals in order to build the manuscript for your dissertation, instead of writing one 300, 500 piece production. And so that's the route that I'm taking. The first article that I plan to publish is to relate the food regimes with food systems currently in Cauca, as well as these 2 indigenous reservations. The second article I plan is to highlight biocultural processes within these reservations and how it connects to food sovereignty. And then the third article will be directly related to the model that will be co-constructed and the methodology of how that was carried out. The bibliography that I've used in this presentation. And thank you all so much, and looking forward to a discussion.
Okay. Okay.